Here's the filter. Comes in a little plastic box. Looks like it comes with filter. It looks like you might be able to take it apart to clean out any particles. Extra O-ring, not quite sure where that goes yet. A couple of hose clamps. This particular one fits 3/8 inch applications. You're about to correct your power steering system. It's a good idea before you go in and start fiddling with things to do a little bit of research. This is a small amount that I've learned from the research that I've done. The first part that we have is your reservoir. The reservoir is where you'll find the cap. The cap's going to tell you what your fluid level is. It's also where you have access to a majority of your fluid, so you can tell if it needs to be changed or maybe if it doesn't need to be changed. From the power steering fluid reservoir, we have the power steering pump. The power steering pump is what pressurizes the fluid and moves it through the system. When the power steering pump is activated, the fluid starts its journey from the reservoir to the pump. From the pump, it's pressurized and sent to a relief valve. From the relief valve, it's sent to a control valve. Now this is called the control valve because it controls where in the power cylinder the fluid goes. Your power steering system works on a concept called pressure differential. This right here inside the cylinder is a piston, and the control valve sends the fluid either to the top of the piston or the bottom of the piston. Usually there's equal amounts of pressure on either side of the piston, but as soon as you differentiate some of that fluid, say we're sending to the top part of the piston, then it's going to put extra pressure on this side of the piston, and it's going to move the piston down, and obviously vice versa. And this is all dependent on which way you're steering your wheel. Now, from steering the wheel, you have your whole steering system, and the fluid from this point goes into the steering system. And there's some videos in the description box that tell you about your steering system and the really brilliant way and how it works. And also you'll find that there is another video that talks about this control valve right here and various other parts much more in depth if you're interested in that. Now, one way or another, all this fluid ends up in a return line and is sent back to your reservoir. This return line is important for us. The parts that we're really worried about is the pump if you need to replace your pump, the reservoir if you're flushing the system, and the return line. You'll disconnect the return line and you will add a splicer and then another hose so that the fluid can be pumped into a bucket or a catch pan, but in this case we're not worried about that. In this case what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking that filter and placing it somewhere on the return line. We're going to cut the return line, we're going to place the filter in there, and it's going to catch the debris that's been building up in your system. That debris can compromise your parts, it could break a part, especially if you're in a newer car. The newer cars have very small areas that the fluid has to travel through, and all that gunk and all that debris gunks up those parts and puts unneeded stress on the parts. We're going to fix that by placing this filter. You'll find that your system works much, much better, less whining, and more smooth operation as a whole. Here's a list of the tools that you're going to need to get the job done. First, you're going to need a funnel. You'll also need a transfer pump. You'll also want a couple of pairs of vice grips. Next, it'll be good for you to have a couple of knives, especially one with some serrated edge. You'll need the filter. You're also going to want something to catch the fluid in. You'll want some clamps as markers. It's also a good idea to have some towels. And you're going to be dealing with oily fluids, so a decent amount of gloves. The first thing that you're going to want to do is locate your cap. Open up the cap to the power steering fluid. There's going to be a steering wheel on it with some fluid indication, or maybe a bunch of letters that spell out power steering fluid. You're going to want to open up that cap and and place it somewhere out of the way, because most of this job is going to be done with the cap out of the way. Now you're going to want to go get your transfer pump. And you're going to want to take those two hoses, plug them into the right places. You're going to have the out going to your catch and the in going to the power steering reservoir. Now you're going to want to pump all that fluid out of there. And once you've got all that fluid out of there, now it's time to do the scary part. And that's locating the return line. You'll find that your return line is right about here. Your return line goes from your steering rack. In this case, it's behind the brake fluid. And it goes all the way down and connects to your reservoir. Now you're going to want to take those markers and you're going to mark the place where you're going to want to cut. Do not cut down there because you're going to want to have free access to this filter. You're going to want to put it in a place where you have easier access to it, like here. We're going to take those clamps and we're going to just use those clamps to mark the area that we want to cut. So go ahead and get that area good and marked. And then you could use scissors if you want, you could use a kitchen knife if you want, but the best thing to cut that line with is a knife with a serrated edge. And once you get that thing cut, the next thing that you're going to want to do is take that filter and you're going to want to shove that puppy into one side and into the other side and make sure it's good and set in there, and make sure the hose clamps are on. Now see right there, that is the arrow that points to the flow direction. It's going to flow from the steering rack to the reservoir. Make sure you have the flow direction correct. That is imperative. Now that you've got all that set up, do not start your car yet because right now your reservoir is empty. You do not want to run a pump dry. So get that funnel, stick it in there. Do not overflow it. It's easy to overflow it, especially if you have to have it stuck all the way in. And when it's like this, you can kind of see what's going on. Don't overflow your steering fluid. Now take your cap and check your fluid. You've got a hot fill line and a cold fill line. It does make a difference if it's hot or cold. You see where it's glossy and then where it's not glossy? The glossy part is obviously where your fluid is. You can see here that the cold line shows us that the fluid level is in the right place. But you're not done yet. You're going to stick that cap on now that you've filled up your reservoir, and you're going to want to turn that car on, and you're going to want to turn your wheel from lock to lock. Get into your car, put the key in, and at this point you're thinking to yourself, did I fill up the reservoir? Okay, yes, I did fill up the reservoir. You start the car up, and now you spin the wheel from lock to lock. And you're going to want to do this about 10, 15, maybe 20 times. You're going to be pushing air out of the system. You could even do this with a cap off. It might be a better idea to do it with the cap off so that the air has free reign to move through the system and up and into the reservoir and out. You're trying to get all the air out of the system. And once you get all the air out of the system, lo and behold, your reservoir level is going to be a little bit lower. So you're going to steer that wheel from lock to lock several times, and then you're going to come back to your filter. You're going to check for leaks. You're going to run your finger along the top part of it. If there's a leak from the top, you're going to find that leak right about there. Run your finger around the top, check your fingers, and see if you find any debris. If it's coming out of the bottom, you're going to find it at the bottom part of the hose or maybe the surrounding areas. Make sure you check all around to make sure that you don't have fluid squirting all over the darn place. Once you see that you don't have any issues and that you're all set, then you go ahead and you pull that cap up and off of there, and check your fluid level. In this case, my fluid level had dropped about an inch or so, maybe a little bit less than that. It was just barely on the end of our top there. As you can see, it's glossy just barely at the end there, so I needed to add just a little bit of fluid. And it's much easier to add fluid than to subtract fluid. Subtracting fluid is tough unless you've got a pump, and even then you might be wondering if you're subtracting the right amount. Another way to pull fluid out is to stick a rag in there and let the rag soak up some of the fluid. But to be honest with you, you could actually damage your system by doing that, because you might be introducing radical particles, and those radical particles, you do not want them running amok within your system, especially one that you just got your filter in. And that's pretty much it. Now that you've got your filter set in there, you're going to want to drive the car for a couple of days, check the fluid level. Check that fluid level every couple of days for a week or more until you know that you've gotten all the air out of the system. And now that you've got that filter in there, you're going to want to check that filter from time to time, especially in the next couple of days if you haven't run your system on a filter in several thousand miles. And you're going to want to empty all the gunk out of there, and do that a couple of times. And then, now you're in a good place to go ahead and do a power steering flush. Now you can pull all that old fluid out of there, and you can put in some new high-grade fluid, knowing that it's not going to get free radicals from the previous usage in it. Good luck.